Part 11 of X. There was a man, the saga of Kahl, a true story. The top of page 88. Dave Brower remained in his driver's seat, hands folded, with his birdshot loaded shotgun untouched by his side. Hobson made his way northward down the east ditch until even with the Hornet and ordered Dave to come into the ditch with him. Dave shook his head negative, but then opened the door slightly, turned and put his feet on the pavement. There he remained until a shot was fired. When the incident was over, Brower told Wegener, who had taken his seat in the Hornet, to hand Gordon his property, a pistol and some ammunition. Wegener did. During the countdown, David later said that he thought he was going to die. Even so, he did not try to defend himself. After placing his feet on the ground, Brower asked Hobson, "Am I under arrest?" Hobson's answer, "No." Hobson then came out of the ditch and went to the rear of the Kahl Chrysler, which was headed into the driveway. He slammed his shotgun across the top rear of the station wagon. "There goes one of your buddies," he shouted, referring to Scott Falls departing the scene. After the first shot, Brower got on the ground, palms on the pavement, praying. Grandma Joan Kahl, during the entire incident, was on the floorboard facing the front passenger seat, praying. Hobson told her to get out and get in the ditch, but she ignored him. He later said, "Maybe it's a good thing she didn't, as I got hurt and she did not." As time passed, her prayers increased in fervor with a touch of hysteria, calling on the name over all names, Jesus. Seeing Yori leave the vehicle and the Ram Charger stop, Scott Fall got out, loaded his rifle, and stood west of the rear door with his Mini 14, which Yori had sold to him. He remained there 2 or 3 minutes, halfway pointing his weapon at those aiming at him, 20 or 30 feet away. But he usually held the piece at a ready position. After some time, Scott asked, "What do you want?" "We want him," was the answer, along with a weapon barrel gesture toward Yori and Grandpa. At this point, 2 or 3 minutes of the countdown had elapsed. Scott's heart tried to leap out of his throat. He was so frightened. My head was pounding with each heartbeat. He began to backpedal westerly towards the entrance of the mobile home. Then, seeing the trees to the north of the mobile home, which served as a windbreaker, he trotted quickly around the east end of the trailer to a small tree on the north side. He was looking back and forth as he traversed the distance, half turning at times with trepidation. He feared being shot in the back. "Everything was racing through my mind," Scott averred. "All my children and my wife. I wanted to get away from the situation that I was apparently in. When I got almost to the tree, somebody started yelling at me from a ways north, 75 to 100 yards distance. That would be Deputy Wigglesworth. He was the passenger in the Muir vehicle as it halted some 75 yards north of the driveway. Scott was making his departure about this time, observed by all. Some of the lawmen may have suspected that Scott was trying to outflank them, to form an Askermischer's line of sorts, rather than get away from the trouble. Why Muir, armed only with a pistol, stopped out of pistol range north of the impasse is explained only by the fact that discretion is the better part of valor. Wigglesworth said, "Ken, we've got one running away. I'm going to cut him off." Saying this, he dismounted with his AR and went north along the road a few steps, then followed a path to the west, crossing the ditch and barbed wire fence. After going about 50 yards west, he broke through the ice in knee-deep water. He then went further north to a few feet to dry ground to a knoll farther from Scott, and assumed a prone firing position. Scott and Wigglesworth each say when they saw the other, he had a weapon pointing at that time. Scott, feeling trapped and terrified, moved around in the pine trees, whose trunks averaged about 4 or 5 inches thick. he could see movement in the house. In fact, Mr. Reardon was loading a gun at that time, unknown by those outside. Wigglesworth was yelling, "United States Marshal, put your weapon down and move back to the highway." But Scott maintained he couldn't tell what the guy was yelling at that distance, 75 to 100 yards away. He was just yelling. Realizing the sparse pines provided little cover, Scott moved back to the corner of the trailer, the northeast corner nearest the road, for protection from Wigglesworth. For some strange reason, Wigglesworth did not observe this, nor did he ever see Scott again that day. He presumed incorrectly that Scott ran westward into the woods and remained there. A search conducted later proved this not to be so. Wigglesworth, following the firefight in which he inexplicably did not participate, later crawled back to the highway, continuing to fear the imaginary threat in the woods. Combat records show that a certain proportion of troops freeze, get buck fever, when confronted with an adversary. Wigglesworth may have retreated somewhat from his position, as Scott was unable to observe him from the trailer, though he tried to. After strong prompting from Hobson, Muir and Schnabel moved their vehicles closer to the driveway and dismounted to the driver's side of each vehicle. One must wonder why they did not come up to the driveway. Inside the trailer were Mr. and Miss Reardon, their two small children, her sister, and Jeff, the sister's husband. Jeff was running to and fro, excited, observing what he could out the window. Most all of them peeked out the windows from time to time. Jeff wanted a gun, but Mr. Reardon thought it was wisest for himself alone to be armed. He loaded a shotgun, but never fired it nor left the house, which they had locked following the telephone call from the firehouse. When Hobson came from the east ditch to the Kahl station wagon, Yor yelled to Gordon, "Watch out behind you." Cheshire resumed his redundant scream. "I'm gonna blow your goddamn heads off. I'm gonna..." He repeated this 5 or 6 times according to Yorrie and others. Now at this juncture, Yorrie told me no one had been told he was under arrest. No identification nor warrant had been shown. The red lights flashing were an indication of law enforcement. Whether or not the marshals had communicated the fact that they indeed were U.S. Marshals to Scott, Yorrie, and Gordon is problematic. Grandpa was probably satisfied that they were marshals. Yorrie and Scott probably suspected as much, but were uncertain. Marshal Muir decided that the time for talk had ended. 9 minutes was enough. It was now time for action. Force. The misdemeanor arrest would now be done Muir's way. Page 92, Chapter 16, Shootout. After Yorrie shouted his warning, Cheshire yelled to Muir, "Come closer!" Pop! The flat report of Muir's pistol rang out. No one observed it. Everyone heard it. Strangely, all government witnesses were later to swear the shot came from the opposite direction, from the south, from Yorrie. This mistaken impression could be for 2 reasons. A bullet makes a crack as it sails by through the sound barrier. Then, too, the .38 caliber slug struck Yorrie's pistol handle in his shoulder holster, making a sound upon the impact and destruction of the grip. Muir must have been amazed in seeing his victim remain standing, wondering if he could have missed. How could he have? Whatever possessed Ken Muir to employ such a tactic is anyone's surmise. We only know that he was a good shot and proudly confident in his ability to hit his target. However, as Deputy Marshal Warren was to point out later, this time it was not paper silhouettes, but real flesh and blood which was his target. As the government attorney later claimed, he may have had a legal right to do so. Nevertheless, anyone with an ounce of common sense would not have done it. Charge it up to fear and panic, I guess. "Who fired?" Cheshire shouted, and Hobson echoed, "Who fired?" At the same time, Yorrie staggered away from the pole, slightly tottering and unable to breathe, and exclaimed, I'm hit. Now being hit by a .38 at that range is comparable to someone hitting you in the chest with a sledgehammer. The energy equals the mass times the velocity squared. It is no wonder that the breath was knocked out of Yori, who perhaps thought he was mortally wounded when only badly bruised. He was in considerable pain. Perhaps Grandma's prayers from the nearby wagon guided the bullet. I'm going to pause here and interject some personal commentary. The bullet hit the handle of a firearm that Yori had on him in his coat, in his chest. What is the odds of that? I want you to think about that. It's very reminiscent of Jeffrey Winehouse being shot at point blank range, yet surviving the 4 bullets. Yori had a similar incident where the bullet was blocked by his firearm that he had in his coat. Picking up with the book. As Grandpa indicated in his letter, had Yori not been wearing his holster, he would have been killed instantly. Had Muir missed the message or forgotten it within 5 minutes that Gordon might have exchanged clothes and was at one of the vehicles, why Yori? 3 or 4 seconds elapsed, then all bedlam broke loose. Yori, from desperation or reflex, may have fired next toward the general direction of Cheshire and the Ram Charger. Cap says this is so. In any event, Yori's 2 unaimed shots in rapid succession in all probability went awry. The government claims they struck the door of the Charger. Yori says, I don't know, I know I didn't hit the door. Cap fired his pump shotgun with double-aught buckshot 4 times at Yori in rapid succession over the cab of the Ram Charger. Cap says he fired after seeing the muzzle flash at Yori's rifle. A muzzle flash in daytime? Well, maybe at 6 p.m. Grandpa said that the shotgun fired first, with Yori firing in reflex to being hit by buckshot. In any event, the shotgun and Yori's rifle were all fired about the same time. Cap, who only recalls firing 2 or 3 times, says that he missed on the first shot and then hit Yori. Must have been like a magpie diving on a wounded gelding. It seems funny to me that someone who has to pump a gun to reload it can't remember that he fired it 4 times. That totaled 36 pellets. Yori fell face down into the mud after being struck by the buckshot, which continued to hit him and to splatter in the mud around him after he had been shot down. It was a miracle of God, Yori said later, that more of the pellets did not hit me. Plenty of them did. Muir shot 3 more times with his pistol, presumably at Yori and Grandpa. The noise and consternation that his target didn't fall initially must have rattled Ken Muir, affecting his usual expert aim. No one knows where these bullets went, but 1 or 2 of them may have caused the flesh wound to Yori's left shoulder or to his chin, which was cut. Cheshire fired his automatic rifle 3 times. 1 of these pierced the baggage rail on top of the Chrysler wagon. Neither Schnabel nor Hobson fired their shotguns, and Wigglesworth, who seems to have disappeared, apparently did not fire his automatic. Who knows for sure? Scott, standing at the corner of the trailer with bullets ricocheting from metal and whistling by, joined the melee. He fired 6 half-aimed shots in rapid succession with his semi-automatic towards the hood and middle of the windshield of the Ram Charger. As Scott fired, his barrel was elevated each time by the recoil. Some of the later bullets pierced the windshield. In all probability, he didn't hit anyone. Scott then saw that Yori was shot down. At this point, he was no longer in the fight. That is, his shooting was over. He turned rescue medic, running to Yori to help him, carrying his long rifle. Like the young coward in Crane's red badge of courage, this valiant effort showed extreme bravery. Love of a friend wrought utter disregard of perilous dangers. What greater love is there than one who laid down his life for a friend? Dave Brower was on the pavement. Wagoner was on the floorboard of the Kahl car at this time, next to Joan, who continued to pray. This left only Grandpa in combat with the 5 lawmen. He had a semi-automatic. They had 2 shotguns, a pistol, and 2 machine guns, automatic rifles, dispersed roughly in a semicircle. Dispersed roughly in a semicircle around him. A facetious observer would contend that the odds were not fair. Had there been twice the number of aggressors and double the number of weapons augmented by a couple of fragmentation grenades and those deployed in a complete circle, then the odds would have been more nearly even. A wag might say. The Federals were never able to make the mistake of being undermanned thereafter when dealing with Grandpa. Hobson was seriously injured in the gunfight, primarily by a piece of pavement being thrown by a bullet into the side of his head. This caused him to be almost totally disabled, perhaps partially permanent. This is especially sad because he alone of the group had no understanding of the situation. He just came along to give Cheshire support. One may question if this justified his conduct. Kenneth Muir was killed while attempting to fire the last round remaining in his pistol. A .223 bullet passed through his arm and struck him in the middle of the chest. He died quickly. Grandpa probably shot Muir, but this is uncertain, as Grandpa does not mention the fact in his account of the gunfight. Some believe that Muir was killed by a Federal bullet, perhaps by crossfire from Cheshire. Since the bullet was so accurately placed, such an accidental impact is unlikely. Cap's trigger finger was severed by a Kahl bullet. Another of Grandpa's shots grazed a superficial cut to Cap's head, but one that bled extensively. Robert Cheshire received 4 significant wounds, the last one blowing the top of his head off, killing him instantly. Keep in mind that Cheshire is the one who, this is Rudy's personal commentary, Cheshire is the one who kept saying, "I'm going to blow your GD head off." And it's his head that got blown off. And his son, just a few years ago, Robert Cheshire's son, if I'm not mistaken, murdered his ex-wife and committed suicide. One was a wound to his hand, perhaps a defensive wound. His other 2 wounds were potentially fatal, one in his neck and another through his left arm and into his chest. These 2 wounds were from bullets which are believed to have first passed through the windshield glass. It is highly probable, almost certain, that all were inflicted by Grandpa. Later that night, he wrote of his role in the shootout. Someone later said, "Gordon was jumping around like a mud hen dodging bullets during the multi-second ordeal. Actually, Grandpa had few bullets to dodge. The tactical mistake of the lawmen from start to finish was the focusing of their attention on persons around the pole primarily, rather than on Grandpa, the real threat at that point." Grandpa wrote as follows, with my additions and comments in parenthesis in this iteration. "As we came over one of the hills just north of Medina, I saw on the top of the next hill what looked like 2 cars parked on it. About this time they turned on their red lights and I knew that the attack was underway. We were just coming to an approach and I told Dave to pull in on it and stop. Our other car pulled in just beyond us and stopped also. I looked back in time to see another vehicle coming from behind with its red light on." Wrong, Grandpa. The light came on after it stopped. I picked up my Mini 14 and got out and got myself and my weapon ready as the vehicle coming from behind skidded to a stop about 20 feet away. The doors flew open on it and the 2 men who were in the front seat aimed their guns at us. My son Yori had jumped out of the other car and had run over to a high-line pole. The 2 cars which we had seen ahead of us pulled up and stopped behind us. A man, Hobson, got out of the vehicle Ram, which came from behind us and ran out into the ditch on the east side of the road. During this time there was a lot of screaming and hollering going on, but nothing else, so it appeared to be an impasse. About this time a shot rang out and the driver of the car, Cheshire, who I believe at this time must have been supposedly in command, turned around and stood up, so he was looking at his man in the east ditch and toward the cars which had come from north and yelled, "Who fired? Who fired?" The other man who was with him, Hobson, echoed his question. At the time the shot rang out, I heard Yori cry out, "I'm hit, I'm hit." I took my eyes off the two men who were yelling who fired and looked over at Yori, who was still standing, but I could tell he was in pain from the way he stood. About this time another shot rang out and I heard Yori cry out again. I looked over and saw that he was hit again and laying on the ground. I looked back toward the two men and saw the one in the passenger side cap aim at me, and I was sure then that they felt the situation was no longer under their control and the only thing to do was to kill us all. Before he was able to fire, I loosed a round at the door behind which he was standing, and while I don't think it hit him, it caused him to duck down behind the door. I looked around again toward Yori and saw Scotty fall running over toward him. I turned my head again in time to see the driver of the vehicle which had followed us, Cheshire, raise up from behind the door and aim at Scotty. I moved my gun over and fired at him before he could shoot. I didn't hit him either. The bullet struck somewhere near the lower left-hand corner of the windshield. I'm going to stop there at the top of page 97. We'll pick up the next part at the top of page 97.